Something remarkable is hidden in the DNA of 1.4 billion people. New genetic research from India just uncovered answers that scientists never expected. And honestly, some of these discoveries are almost impossible to believe. Ancient ghost populations that no longer exist. A continent-wide genetic phenomenon created entirely by culture, not geography. And some of the oldest human DNA on Earth, preserved in a way that defies everything we thought we knew. This 50,000-year-old mystery is about to get very interesting. Look at India closely. 1.4 billion people speaking over 780 distinct languages, across more than 4,600 different ethno-cultural groups. It's not just a country, it's an entire continent's worth of human diversity, compressed into one nation. But here's what most people don't realize. Behind this incredible human tapestry, there's a story that connects every single person on that subcontinent, not through history, culture, or religion, but through something far more fundamental, their DNA. For decades, the genetic story of India remained a puzzle. Scientists had clues and fragments of data, but never the complete picture. Why? Simple. The vast majority of genomic research has been European-centric, with individuals of European descent sequencing their own genomes. That's changing now. A massive study published this year completely transformed everything we thought we knew. Researchers performed whole genome sequencing on over 2,600 people from India, sampling dozens of different languages and capturing individuals from rural, tribal, and urban communities. What they found is absolutely mind-blowing. In one study, they made 3 major discoveries. First, a treasure trove of genetic variants previously unknown to science. Over 70 million unique genetic markers. And get this, 30 million were completely new, never seen before, likely existing only within the Indian subcontinent. Second, something truly bizarre, a continent-wide island effect created not by oceans, but by culture itself. Third, some of the most intact stretches of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA found anywhere on Earth. You might be thinking, why would ancient human DNA be preserved better in India than anywhere else? The answer involves a cultural practice that's been shaping human genetics for thousands of years. And what scientists discovered is both fascinating and deeply uncomfortable. But first, we need to talk about ghosts. From a population genetics perspective, this new data revealed something scientists have studied for years, the Indian cline. Cline is just a fancy word for gradient, like a paint swatch smoothly changing color from top to bottom. The Indian cline is a genetic gradient, showing that, generally speaking, the further north you go in India, the more genetic similarity you see to Western Eurasia, places like the Middle East and Europe. The further south you go, the less connection with Western Eurasia. It's a near smooth continuum. That raises an obvious question. What are the source populations that created this genetic line? For years, scientists spoke about 2 ghost populations that initiated this genetic line. We call them ghost populations because they no longer exist as distinct groups, but their DNA lives on in their descendants. These 2 ghost populations, ancestral North Indian and ancestral South Indian, simple enough, right? The North group and South group mixed, creating this linear pattern. But when scientists looked closer at this new data, it blew the old story completely out of the water. The DNA of these ancestral groups, the ancestral North Indian and ancestral South Indian, they were already mixed. That led to a shocking question. Who were the ghost populations of these ghost populations? It's like genetic ghost inception. Let's build this from the ground up. The genetic bedrock of the continent comes from a specific group called ancestral ancient South Indian. These were indigenous hunter-gatherer groups, whose closest living relatives are individuals from the Andaman Islands, who still today live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Thousands of years ago, these hunter-gatherers mixed with another group, ancient farmers, who migrated from the west, most likely modern-day Iran. The mixture of these 2 ancient lineages created the ancestral South Indian ghost population, the foundation layer of modern India. But that's only part of the story. A new group was about to emerge on the scene, and their arrival would reshape everything. Later on, we're not entirely sure when, a new group appeared. Pastoralists from the Eurasian steppe, the vast grasslands of Central Asia. These steppe people mixed with the ancestral South Indians living in the northern parts of India, or modern-day Pakistan. This blend of steppe pastoralists and ancient South Indians living in the northern part of the subcontinent created the ancestral North Indian ghost population. Think about what this means. The 2 main ingredients of modern India, ancestral North Indian and ancestral South Indian, were already mixed populations themselves. The Indian cline, this near-linear continuum, represents the mixing of these two ghost populations in different proportions over thousands of years. When researchers crunched the numbers, their models were a near-perfect fit. They could explain the genetic diversity and distributions of their new data source of over 2,600 individuals from across the country using these three ancient lineages. Overall, the source populations of modern India are comprised of the original hunter-gatherers, Iranian-related farmers, and Eurasian steppe pastoralists. It's an incredibly elegant story for such a complex and large population today. But India isn't just a north-south axis. What happens when you look east? Researchers found something completely different. The DNA of these populations told a distinct story. They found a very strong and direct link to East Asia. This lines up perfectly with another piece of evidence. Language. Many languages within this region belong to the Austroasiatic language family and are thought to have originated from Southeast Asia. You have a genetic link and a linguistic link pointing in the same direction. This reveals a strong ancient connection to seafarers that may have traveled the Bay of Bengal over 1,000 years ago from Southeast Asia. Thanks to this study, we can even put a date on it. Researchers estimate gene flow from Southeast Asia entered West Bengal around 50 generations ago. If we do the math, that's roughly 1,500 years ago, and what that timing reveals is absolutely incredible. Pause for a moment. How incredibly cool is that? We're not just talking about some distant echo from the past. We can put a direct timestamp on this migration event. And it wasn't that long ago either. This was during the Gupta Empire in India and the northern and southern dynasties in China. We can use modern genetics and techniques to see the faint echoes of human migration over 1,000 years ago during recorded history. Through genomics of the modern population, we've found so much. It's a continent-spanning story of ancient mixing events. Ancient hunter-gatherers meeting farmers, steppe pastoralists sweeping in from the north, seafarers arriving from the east. It paints a picture of India as a great melting pot from which modern-day Indians descend. That's when the story takes a sharp, fascinating, and frankly very uncomfortable turn in the opposite direction. If India's deep history is about mixing, why, when we look into the genetics of the last few hundred or even few thousand years, do we find the exact opposite? If the genetic diversity of India was a cocktail with lots of ingredients added to it, at some point it stopped stirring. The answer is a powerful cultural force that has left one of the most unique genetic patterns on the planet. I'm talking about the widespread and ancient practice of endogamy, marrying within a specific group. This is frankly fascinating, very odd, and somewhat disturbing, but very fascinating from an anthropological viewpoint. For thousands of years, many communities across India have had strict rules on who they can and cannot marry, restricting their gene pools into tight subgroups of people that have been pre-selected. This plays a major role in terms of marriage, and the effect on modern Indian society is more profound than most people realize. But why does this practice exist? And what does it actually do to human DNA? Listen to how people describe the reality. We are millennials almost at that age of getting married. People are not giving a damn about the person and the relationship and how to build that. Rather, just like you fall under the same caste, you fall under the same financial bracket. Let's go for it. Here's the deeper truth. Your caste is associated with your economic status. It's associated with which languages you speak, where you grew up, what kind of pop culture you were exposed to, what kind of references you understand, the circles that you move in socially speaking, the school you went to. So yeah, it has a huge effect on who you date, because it has a huge effect on who you're exposed to at all to begin with, who you're friends with, who you work with. A lot of people who don't actively consciously think that they only want to date within a particular caste still end up dating within a particular caste. It's not entirely a coincidence. It's systemic. Why is it so important in Indian society to stay within the same caste? Only a few castes, only the ritually upper ones. Traditionally are landowners, for example. They're the ones who traditionally have higher paying jobs, and things like that. When you have intercaste marriage, there's more distribution of those resources, which a lot of people are against. It also has to do with an idea of ritual purity, which again, some castes are considered to be more pure than others, and intercaste dating and marriages and contact is supposed to pollute or cause them to be impure. In many cases, this even includes consanguinity, or marriage between close relatives. From a modern medical perspective, consanguinity is a bad idea. It really restricts the gene pool and encourages rare hereditary genetic disorders to be more commonly occurring within offspring. But from a population genetics and anthropological viewpoint, this is very fascinating because it creates something known as founder effect. And what founder effect does to a population over hundreds of years is almost unbelievable. Let me explain what founder effect is. Imagine a small group of people, let's say 50, leave the mainland and decide to exist on an island thereafter. This small group will only have a fraction of the total genetic diversity found on the mainland. As their population grows over the next 100 years, and assuming there's no gene flow from outside this island, everyone living on that island will be descendants of the original 50 founders. This means the unique genetic quirks of the original 50 founders would be amplified in their descendants. That's classic founder effect. For example, if half of the individuals that founded that island had blue eyes, whereas only 10% of the people on the mainland have blue eyes will become a much more dominant feature on individuals on the island compared to individuals on the mainland. Now, looking at India, there are thousands of communities that for centuries or even thousands of years have acted as cultural islands. In most cases, they were not isolated by geography either. They were isolating themselves based on their social norms and practices. They were living right next to each other for centuries, but not mixing their genes. This has created thousands of distinct founder effects all across the population of the Indian subcontinent, and it's absolutely insane. One researcher described it this way: of mixture, but it froze, and the freezing happened 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, and it froze because of cultural change. The cultural change happens which locks in the caste system, and people freeze, and they stop mixing very much. So what you see is, instead of people collapsing to a point, which is what you see in Europe, you see this gradient forming, and it's stable, because of the enduringness of the caste system, which is documented in the early texts like the Rig Veda. You actually have a snapshot going back a couple of thousand years without this continuing change. Thanks to this high-resolution data from this new study, we can see literal proof of endogamy written on the chromosomes, and the specific genetic signature scientists found is almost impossible to believe. The specific genetic signature we look for is called identity by descent, or IBD. Think of it this way. You have a set of chromosomes, one from your mother and one from your father. They also have a set of chromosomes, one from their mother and one from their respective fathers. But if your mum and dad share a recent common ancestor, let's say they share the same father, there's a good chance you'll inherit the exact same stretch of DNA from both your mother and father. When scientists scanned for these IBD signatures, what they found in the Indian population was just staggering. Let's put this into context. On average, in East Asians, Europeans, and Africans, they have on average 4 to 6 centimorgans. That's the unit used to measure chromosome length that are identical by descent. Longer measurements are indicative of more frequent and recent consanguineous relations. Care to have a guess for the average IBD in India? 29 centimorgans. Let that sink in. That's roughly 5 times the amount seen in other parts of the world. This is a direct and measurable genetic echo of endogamy, a social practice which has shaped the DNA of over 1 billion people. Its history not written in stone, but written in our own biology. The powerful cultural force known as endogamy has created these long stretches of identical DNA in a lot of Indians, and these can act as timestamps for the last few thousand years. But it didn't just preserve recent history. It accidentally preserved something much, much older. Echoes of genetic encounters that happened over 50,000 years ago with humans who weren't quite Homo sapiens. I'm talking, of course, about our ancient cousins, Neanderthals and Denisovans. Quick refresher. We know that all humans that migrated out of Africa met and mingled with other archaic hominins. As a result, pretty much all non-African people walking the earth today carry between 1% to 4% of their DNA from these ancient relatives. The researchers asked the obvious question: how much genetic flow was between Neanderthals, Denisovans, and the ancient Indians? What they found would lead to one of the most significant discoveries in the entire study. To figure this out, you needed a baseline. For this, they used the genomes from sub-Saharan populations in Africa, who have very little, if any, DNA from Neanderthals and Denisovans. The researchers crunched the numbers and found that, on average, people from the Indian subcontinent have about 1.5% of their genome derived from these archaic hominins. Broken down even further, that's about 1.4% of their genetic variants from Neanderthals, and a much smaller slice, 0.1% of their genetic variants from Denisovans. To put this into context, Indians generally have pretty similar levels of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA to Europeans and people in the Americas. They have a lot less Neanderthal DNA than East Asians, and they have way less Denisovan DNA than Oceanians, who are the world champions of having Denisovan ancestry. So you might be wondering, okay, cool, Indians have some Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, but it's nothing special. Why are we talking about this in an Indian genetics video? That's when the story of endogamy comes roaring back in the most unexpected way. The researchers found a scientific jackpot for Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA. Remember how endogamy created those cultural islands preserving long intact stretches of DNA, which we measured by IBD? Those don't just apply to recent DNA. It acted as a genetic time capsule for more ancient segments too. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine you're trying to reassemble a lost ancient book, and all you have are tiny fragments. A word here, a sentence there, scattered across thousands of different libraries across the world. It's incredibly difficult to piece together the story based on these tiny fragments. After over 50,000 years of reproduction, the ancient DNA has been chopped up and shuffled into smaller and smaller pieces. But then you get to the Indian subcontinent, and it's a different story because of their unique history of endogamy. You don't just find a single word, you find whole paragraphs, sometimes even entire pages, of ancient Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA perfectly preserved. What exciting times we're living through. We are living through a revolution in our ability to read the story written in our own cells. The same cultural practice that created thousands of isolated genetic islands across India, the same practice that froze genetic mixing 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, accidentally became a preservation system for some of the oldest human DNA on Earth. Think about what this means. While endogamy has medical challenges for modern populations, restricting gene pools and increasing the frequency of rare genetic disorders, it simultaneously created an invaluable scientific resource. These long, intact stretches of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA give researchers a clearer window into our ancient past than almost anywhere else on the planet. The irony is profound. A cultural system designed to maintain separation and purity ended up preserving a biological record of humanity's most ancient mixings, our encounters with other human species tens of thousands of years ago. India's unique history created a genetic time capsule, storing pieces of our shared human story that have been lost or fragmented everywhere else. The researchers discovered over 30 million genetic variants never seen before in science. They mapped the ghost populations that built modern India through waves of migration and mixing, spanning tens of thousands of years. They documented how culture can reshape human genetics on a continental scale. They found some of the most pristine examples of ancient human DNA anywhere on Earth. All of this from studying 2,600 genomes. All of this from looking closely at a population that had been largely overlooked in genomic research. The story of India's DNA is a story of humanity itself, written in genes, preserved by culture, waiting to be read.